Okay, I know this is a little different than all my other YouTube videos, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that this one is going to be longer than most of my other videos, and two is I have a lot of notes in front of me and things I wanted to make sure I touched and covered, and I didn't want to be rustling around through the papers on camera. It would have looked terrible and been awful. So I thought the better way to do this is to kind of do it as a podcast type thing and then just upload the podcast to a still frame on YouTube and go about it that way. Now, I want to preface this whole discussion with a few things because this is a very tumultuous, hot topic that is bound to upset some people if they listen to this. So let me start with this whole situation with the racial tensions that are going on, police brutality, our president, a pandemic that's killed over 115,000 Americans, and a looming potential depression ahead of us, and the fact that the pandemic is not even over. So we have a lot of things going on at once. And then you throw on top of this fire some more gasoline of the George Floyd killing and protests and racial tensions and police brutality, and things just seem to get turned up to a level of heat so high that it's boiling over, and we need to lower the heat. We need to turn the dial down. We can't turn the dial down unless we talk honestly and truthfully about the situation of police brutality and racial bias and racism and everything else that comes along with it. Honestly, we have to talk about the facts. We have to talk about the data. We have to talk about real life experience. And we can't let the reality of those things make us get so emotionally charged that we shut down conversation or even silence people from speaking at all. Secondly, we can't be canceling people for the words that they say or the words that maybe their spouse say. This is not a society you want to cultivate. So, conversations are all we have in a civil society, and it's really all we should have in order to persuade each other and reason with one another to a better society. So when conversation isn't allowed, you're not allowed to say certain things for fear for losing your job or for fear for your spouse losing their job, or you're not even really allowed to think those thoughts. So you change the way you think so that when you hear certain things out in the world, they don't offend you as much because you've now changed the way you think. But the way you think isn't actually what's happening in reality. When this all breaks down, the only next step is violence. And we can't allow that to happen. Unfortunately, in this scenario, in this climate we're in, with social media in particularly, it seems that just about all communication and conversations have become performative. And this is why I deem someone like Candace Owens so toxic to our public discourse. Because she may be right on certain things, but she is a grifter the likes I've never seen. She's very good at it. She's smart. And it seems to be very performative. None of that is good for the public discourse. And we have to be able to reason with each other, talk each other through these topics with being genuine, without it being a performance. And we have to stop bullying people and scaring them into silence or into talking about it in a manner that is not reflective of reality. And they start saying things everyone else hears and knows that doesn't line up with the data and the truth, but everyone just kind of nods along in agreement because the truth and the data is too radioactive to touch, to talk about and there's too much to lose if you speak it. So what I want to do here is talk about some of this stuff, and I know 100% it's bound to piss off some people on both sides of this argument. I'm certain of some things that I'm going to say here are going to make you feel a certain way. And what you have to know is that the way these words make you feel is not an argument. It's not an argument. You're feeling a certain way is not a counterpoint to what I'm about to say. Let's start with one of the misunderstandings I see from people who genuinely tend to be on the right in this discussion with people on the left. If you can't understand why it upsets people more when they see cops killing people more than when criminals kill people, I don't know what to tell you. Now, it's obviously awful when anyone murders someone, regardless of whether the person who's the murderer is a cop or not. But it's particularly different when it's a cop who murders someone unjustly, when the cop's main purpose is to protect and serve that person that they just killed. So if you can't see the difference there, you need to do a little more thinking on the topic before you even discuss it further with other people. And speaking of discussing these topics, we need to completely get away from identity politics in this realm. We can't allow the color of someone's skin be a disqualifier for what they say. The validity of their words should be a disqualifier from talking on the topic, but not the color of their skin. Whatever they say is either helpful or hurtful, is either false or true, regardless of the color of their skin. Now, here's another inconvenient, hard truth, but this one tends to be more directed at people who are on the left. The debate on whether or not cultures differ and those cultural norms causing different behavioral outcomes, that's a thing. Okay, so nature versus nurture, I'm sure everyone's heard this before. It's a combination of both, obviously. It's not one or the other. But the nurture is linked to the culture. So there are cultural norms among all different groups of people. And those cultural norms are going to cultivate different behaviors in the people from those cultures. This really is not controversial, but it is a truth that many people, in particularly on the left in this debate, they do not want to hear. But it's true nonetheless. Something else that is true that I think most of us can agree upon is, in particularly throughout the protest, there are a lot of instances that we were subject to seeing that screams that there is a lot of problems with policing. I mean, many of us saw videos of the police just outright assaulting and abusing peaceful protesters. In some instances, it made the police officers seem like psychopaths. And I have other videos addressing how I think we should handle this. We need to stop talking about defunding or abolishing the police. We need to get real on this. In many instances, we may need more funding, right? If we want to train police better and we want to have better people on the force, and we want to have them go through training longer. These police forces may need more funding in order to get those things done. And straight out abolishing the police is completely nonsensical. It's a non-starter for most people. Stop talking about it. And I actually think that in a few weeks here, people won't talk about it because it's so mind-numbingly dumb. I, for one, think we need to go after police unions and the power they have to collectively bargain. And I have YouTube videos and videos I've done in the past that touch on that, and I will put a link to the relevant video here popping up on the screen somewhere. I'm not going to touch on all that here. It's a whole nother topic, and like I said, I've spoken about it before. This brings me to the racial component of police brutality and policing in this country. So we need to touch on a few different topics here. We need to talk about the data that we have collected over the years based on policing in black neighborhoods, with policing versus black and white arrests and so forth and so on. Now, before I do that, let me just name a few names that I'm sure most of you have never heard of. One is Daniel Shaver. Another is Andrew Thomas. Another is Lauren Simpson. Another is Tony Timpa. These are all the names of white men who were unjustly killed by police officers. Now, there's a reason you probably never heard them. It's because when they're killed, the media isn't making it a huge thing. There aren't protests for their justice. And it's generally localized to the cities or states that they were killed in. I mean, we need to look at these instances and assess them on an individual basis. The same needs to be done if the person who was killed or wrongfully assaulted was black. Right? So we can't blanket and generalize the Alton Sterling, the Philando Castile, the Michael Brown, the Eric Gardner situation, and the George Floyd situation. We need to assess each situation differently. Now, for the names I mentioned of the people who were white and wrongfully killed by the police, I implore you to just do some quick Google searches about them. The details of some of these instances and the videos of some of these instances will just be shocking, disgusting, horrific. For instance, I will touch on a little bit of one of them. The one of Alex Thomas. He was killed, and the officer who killed him got off with basically just negligence of discharging his firearm. He was only sentenced to 180 days in jail and 3 years probation. He shot him in the neck one time. He shot Alex in the neck, and there was 11 minutes in between the officer, whose name is Patrick Fester. Patrick Fester shot this man, and there was an 11-minute time before he actually told a soul that he fired his gun once, and it ended up hitting Thomas. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't tell any of the first responders, even the police officers who showed up initially. The man only did 180 days in jail and 3 years probation. Now, again, this probably has a lot to do with the police unions and how much power they have over these situations. The Daniel Shaver one is also completely egregious, and how the officers resigned, and long story short, they basically still have their pension today. They were never did any time in jail at all. You watch that video and you will be absolutely horrified. Now, none of this is to say or demean or lower the instances of where the individual killed is black. But what I'm saying to you is that you need to understand that there is, you're being shown one side of this story. And we can't have one side of the story every time one of these videos surface that our country is boiling over with hate, with riots and violence. Because there are 10 million arrests every year. And if you think there isn't going to be another arrest of a white cop killing a black man on video, you're living in a fantasy world. But we need to look at these situations individually. Most recently, there was one a couple of days ago in Atlanta. This guy, Rayshard Brooks, who was shot in the back, I think 3 times by the officer as he was running away. Now, if that's all you heard, you may think like, oh my God, what happened in that scenario? But he resisted arrest, wrestled with the officers, ended up getting away from the officers and taking one of their stun guns, one of their tasers. He then runs away and points it back at one of the officers. Now, I'm not sure if this killing was justified or not. For one, the officers had his car, they had his identification. They probably didn't need to discharge their firearm. They could have went and picked him up at a later time. At the same time, you need to understand that wrestling with an officer is already setting you up for death. While you may be unarmed and you may not have a gun, the officer has one on his hip. There's a gun already on the table, and if you overpower him or get his stun gun and stun him, he has to think that he may get shot. So there has to be something in your mind that understands that and allows you to not wrestle with an officer. That's not the time to fight what you may think is the wrongful arrest of you, but I'm not sure you'd be the best judge of that. The best time to fight that would be at the precinct, preferably with a lawyer at your side, and then you can tell him how much of an idiot he is and how he's going to lose his job and how much you dislike him. That would be the best time for that. And, like I said, each case is different. The Philando Castile case was completely egregious. The man was doing everything the officer asked him to do. And he still got shot. Now, we don't have video of the Michael Brown case, so it's hard to know what's what, but there were some first-hand witnesses who said Michael Brown punched the officer, I forget his name, and a wrestling match ensued. Again, there's a gun on the table. You can't wrestle with the officer and then not expect them to think that you can overpower them and get their gun. Now, what makes not talking about each individual case separately and honestly so pernicious is it allows real racists and real white supremacists, it gives them a shred of credibility when they're the only ones talking about these topics. And we can't give assholes like that an ounce of credibility. So that means the good people, the people who want to help solve these problems, the people who have the best interests at heart for all parties involved, need to be allowed to talk about these topics honestly. This brings me to another instance of Breonna Taylor, where I'm seeing, pretty prominent people, blue check Twitter, even some people in the media talking heads, pundits, saying you can be killed for sleeping while black. Stuff like that is not helping our conversation. We can't just jump to the conclusion that she was killed because she was black. We need some evidence behind that. Another likely outcome of a situation like this could be that this is an absolute terrible policy of a no-knock raid that is perpetuated and is a symptom of the horrendous war on drugs in this country. You sprinkle on some complete incompetence by the police who had the wrong address, and you'll see that something like this could be completely unrelated from race. Again, this is a policy failure of no-knock raids, which is completely immoral and mind-numbingly stupid in a country with gun ownership as high as it is. I mean, think about if the officers get the wrong address. So they get the wrong address. You know you haven't done anything wrong, but you hear people knocking your door down, yelling police, or in some instances not yelling police, but as if yelling police is even sufficient in doing anything, because in your mind, you know you haven't done anything. So you're probably very rationally thinking, why would the police be here? These can't be cops. So you go and reach for your gun, which you purchased for home defense, like every other American does in this country. If this doesn't completely paint a picture to you why a no-knock raid is unconscionable, then I don't know what will. But we can't just jump to the conclusion that they shot her because she was black. Again, it sounds like a complete and utter incompetent failure of the police getting the wrong address, stemmed from the horrendous war on drugs. And you throw all that together with cops who are already busting down a no-knock raid, who are trigger happy, thinking that the person behind the door is some sort of major drug lord, potentially has a gun. And you'll see how this can quickly go wrong. Now let's get into some of the data on crimes and police homicide and homicide in general. So I mentioned before, there are 10 million arrests each year. And the police kill roughly about 1,000 people each year. Of that 1,000, around 50% are white, around 25% are black. But if you were just listening to the narrative being perpetuated and disseminated widely by mainstream media and most of your friends, I'm sure, and people you talk to on a daily basis, you would think that those statistics have to be wrong. But they're not. Another interesting statistic is nationwide, blacks are 6 times more likely to get murdered than whites. And around 95% of those murders are committed by African Americans. And this is where the Black Lives Matter and branding runs up against other people's understanding of what's going on and why it seems like they don't support Black Lives Matter, and they probably don't, but it's not because they're racist. Although there sure are many racists out there who won't support Black Lives Matter and never will. No one's denying that. But while Black Lives Matter definitely is a slogan and a brand that anyone can get behind, there's many times and oftentimes when branding and slogans don't actually match the reality of what that brand or slogan does. Take Antifa, for instance, anti-fascist. Well, who is an anti-fascist? Everyone can get behind that. But we all know, as long as you pay attention enough, that these are completely misguided people who actually carry out the actions they carry out are more in line with fascism than not. And they really have no coherent, cohesive understanding of what's going on or what they're trying to do. Another one you have, for instance, is the Nazis, right? The Nationalist Socialist Party. But they weren't actually socialist, like many right-wing political commentators would have you believe. So while the Black Lives Matter slogan, everyone can get behind, but for many, they see that the slogan doesn't actually align with what's happening with the reality of the data. And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where people get hung up on this topic. So while they agree that Black Lives Matter, they don't actually think the slogan matches what the group, the movement, is trying to accomplish. They think that they leave out and don't focus on other matters at hand that cause many of the problems that they rightfully point out. That Black Lives Matter rightfully points out many of the problems, but they're not addressing it in the manner that would actually solve these problems. Because the data we have is completely glossed over by Black Lives Matter, or you're not even allowed to discuss it for fear of losing your job or the mob on Twitter or the mob on Facebook coming for you and losing friends over it. Because if you discuss the reality of this topic, that is a sin too far. Now, we can discuss why the reasonings are the data is the way it is. There are a lot of reasons, I'm sure. And if you're listening to someone or anyone who thinks that they know how to solve these problems, or they think that these are the exact reasons why this is happening and nothing else, you're probably not listening to an honest person. This topic is very deep. It involves a lot of different fields of study, and any one all-encompassing solution is bound to fall short. But let's discuss some of the disparities throughout time that could have potentially led to the actual racial inequalities we see today. And this is where you will get the real racists and the real white supremacists and the people who have confirmation bias and are cognitively limited. They get hung up on this. And many of these people are on the right. So, for instance, the penalties for crack and powder cocaine was effectively racist. Now, there's really no arguing that. The penalties were vastly different. We understand that one group of people used the crack cocaine more than the powder cocaine, and the penalties were extremely different. Another one is redlining, which obviously affected blacks and allowed them, or didn't allow them, to use the number one way how Americans accumulate wealth in this country, which is through property and owning homes. And this was only outlawed in 1968. That wasn't that long ago, okay? That wasn't that long ago. There are many people who perhaps still live in a home or just sold that home maybe once or two times removed, who were discriminated against because of this policy. Now, if you can't understand that that probably still affects them today and their family today, you again need to do some reading and research on this topic before you have discussions about it. And then obviously the other two, which are Jim Crow and slavery, still have lingering effects today. Now, to what degree or level is hard to quantify. It's difficult to discern how much. I'm sure for others it's more, but to deny the fact that they have no lingering effects today is fallacious. And then obviously that brings me to the war on drugs, which is another just incredibly horrific and immoral and stupid policy, which seems to disproportionately affect black people. We know this through the rates of marijuana use by blacks and whites. It's been heavily researched, and it seems that blacks tend to be locked up more, even though they use marijuana in the same similar rates as whites. You also have the instance of heavily researched when you have obvious black name on an application versus a generic white name on an application. And it's less likely that the applicant with the black name is going to get a call back than opposed to the one with the white name. Now, that's obviously going to hinder that person's ability to get a job and acquire income, which will hinder their ability to acquire wealth and do things like invest in the stock market or buy homes or build a family, and the knockoff effects just continue. Obviously. The median income in this country for whites is $170,000. The median income. For blacks, it's $17,000. That's a tenfold difference. Now, I'm sure some of the things I just mentioned about the inequalities are to blame for that. Do we know how much? Probably not. It's very difficult to quantify. But to deny that they have no bearing on that is simply fallacious. This, to me, is one of the underlying issues why we're seeing so much civil unrest. So while the killing of George Floyd was horrific and horrendous, and hopefully Chauvin goes away for a very long time, and the officers involved need to be held accountable as well, who stood around and did nothing. And we need to dismantle police unions. And we need to have policing more localized. We need to have the police force mirror more of the people that they are to protect and serve. We need to have the policemen work and live in the community they police. This means the police officers have a higher stake in the community in which their children play and go to school, and they rest their head at night. So this is another instance where we need probably more funding for police. We may need to pay them a little better so that they can afford to live in the cities, which we know generally have higher cost of living, which is another knock against the whole defunding the police narrative. But the disparities we're seeing of wealth and income in the richest nation on the face of this earth that has ever been is enormous. And it can't continue. Now, if you deny that there are massive wealth and income gaps in this country, we can't even have a discussion. You need to fix that way of thinking before you can have an honest discussion about this topic. Because there obviously are, and we need to figure out ways to lower that income inequalities, among other inequalities of opportunity, not outcome. We don't want everyone to get the same outcome, but we need to lower the playing field of the equality of opportunities and income, whether that's through things like we need police reform. We need tax reform. We need climate reform. The list goes on and on. Healthcare. All of these things would help the impoverished the most. It obviously would help the impoverished white community, the impoverished Hispanic, the impoverished black community. Now, a lot of those types of reforms are only being spoken about by one side of the aisle. Pay attention to that. We'll wrap it all up with a lot of what's happening may be beneficial for Trump. Now, the polling doesn't necessarily say that, but I do believe that there are a lot of people who are afraid to announce their support for someone like Trump because he's so odious. He's such an idiot, an incompetent moron who seems to have nefarious motives. And there are people who are afraid to publicly say they support him. So the polls may be a little off. I'm not sure how much, but they may be off. But I truly believe that Trump is an existential threat to our democracy. You know, and I've always wondered if it was hyperbole to say we are living in Weimar Germany circa the 1930s. But it very well may be. Civilizations crumble and democracies have willingly given their freedoms away before. So we cannot let that happen. Part of not letting that happen is stop talking about defunding the police, stop talking about abolishing the police, ostracize the people who are, talk to them and try to talk them down from that ledge. And if they won't stop spouting that nonsense, just ignore them. Just ignore them. Again, these conversations are difficult. They're hard to have. But we need to have them, and we need to have them honestly. And you can't get emotionally hijacked when you talk about this stuff or hear people talk about this stuff. There are discrepancies on both sides, and many people, whether you're a left ideologue or a right ideologue, they're getting some portion of this discussion completely wrong. Whether it's the police brutality, or it's the statistics, or it's the Black Lives Matter, or it's you name it. But again, we can't just cancel everyone who has the wrong opinion on this topic or who says something out of ignorance. We can't bully and scare people away from even talking about it honestly. It's become almost like religious heresy to talk about these things. And anyone who knows me or has listened to any of my stuff before, you'll understand that I have not a second to even deal with religion and dogma and sanctimony in 2020. We need to move beyond that as a species and start talking about hard-hitting topics honestly and not getting emotionally hijacked from them. Otherwise, it may devolve into something that none of us want to see. And we should be doing our best to avoid at all costs.